Good morning. How's everyone doing? All right. Couple of things as we get started. I'm going to pass these out. I assume that's why they were up here. It's a reminder for the 4th and 5th grade Super Bowl of Caring. So I'll start these around. If you can take one, pass them back. And I only have is it on the back? Let me see. Oh, there's something on the back too. Good, okay. It's about I thought they were two separate things. Building strong marriages. So there's some information on the back. Is this I have no idea what this is. Marriage builder kits. Okay, so information on the back. The other side is Super Bowl of Caring. All right. Boy, we have a ton of stuff to cover today. And our main task today is to look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, what I call the big but. But what about Paul? What about Paul and 1 Timothy? We're going to look a little more carefully at this, but to get into that, kind of a starter question. Have you ever wondered how it is that we go about translating ancient languages? How do we do it? Google, okay, yeah. I can tell you Google Translate is my friend. I have an intimate relationship with Google Translate.
Compared to other ancient languages that have figured out or think they figured out?
Okay. Definitely. We can compare it with let's say, the same text in another language. There's a really famous example of this that actually helped us break or crack the code for Egyptian hieroglyphics. Does anyone know what it was? The Rosetta Stone. It had the same text written in Egyptian hieroglyphics in a language called Demotic, which was a more modern Egyptian, and Greek. And so between those three, they were actually able to, for the first time, this is in the 1800s, figure out how to read hieroglyphics. Before that, they had no clue how to read them. And there have been other examples like that where we have similar texts and we can use them to figure out what one or the other means. We can also look at similarities with related languages. So languages tend to be in families. So, for example, Hebrew is a Semitic language. And there are other Semitic languages like Aramaic and Ugaritic is another one, a Canaanite language, that all share a lot of similarities. In fact, sometimes they are so similar that it's hard to tell which is which. Sometimes, though, it just takes sort of cracking the code. People will use algorithms and look for, letter frequencies or sound frequencies and compare what symbols show up multiple times and make estimates. And sometimes they can actually sort of mathematically crack the language code because languages tend to follow logic until they don't. But they generally follow a logical pattern that can be deciphered. But what do we do if we have a word that only occurs once in the Bible?
Context.
How do we figure it out?
Delete it.
What's that?
Delete it.
Delete it? Okay, yeah, ignore it. Say it doesn't exist.
Context.
Context, okay. Again, we can compare it with another, how does another, we're blessed in the Bible, we have a Greek translation, we have a Hebrew translation, we also have later translations in Syriac and in Ethiopic and in other languages, and we can see how other people have dealt with this word. We can also see how the word's used outside the Bible, but we have to be careful to make sure that we're using something from the same or similar time period, and that it's also a similar type of text or literature. So, for example, words change meaning. Languages are living things. In my research area deals with film and the Bible, and one of my film classes, we had to watch a very early film from the late 1800s, and it's called The Gay Shoe Clerk. Okay? Well, I can assure you that the gay shoe clerk is anything but gay by the modern definition of that word. In fact, it's kind of just the opposite. Okay? He's kind of a womanizer. And so, looking at a word and what it means in one time may not mean what it means in another time. So finding what the word means in a similar period is kind of important. And also how it's used within certain kinds of literature can also help us decipher words. A word that might be used in a legal context might have a different meaning than how we might use it day in and day out. Okay, I'll give you an example. There's one in the Bible that, and then we can guess based on other data like context. Okay, and sometimes all we can do is guess. Here's an example. This is from 2 Samuel 5, verses 6 through 8. It says, "Then," this is talking about David, "the king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, 'You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off.' They thought, 'David cannot get in here.' Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. On that day, David had said, 'Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind, who are David's enemies. That is why they say, the blind and lame will not enter the palace.'" Now, I've highlighted that word water shaft. Okay? The Hebrew word is tzinor. And it occurs 3 times in the Bible, and we have not a clue what it means. Not a clue. So why do they translate water shaft?
Archaeology.
Aha! In the 1800s, an explorer and archaeologist is probably too strong a word, but a very influential man whose last name is Warren, started at the Pool of Siloam down in the southern part of the city, the city of David, where the water would kind of come out, and he decided to crawl up and explore where the water came from. And so he crawled with a candle through this tunnel, and it had filled with refuge to the point that it was sometimes just a fairly small tunnel to crawl through. The spring is what's called a gushing spring, which means every so often a surge of water comes out. And so at one point in the tunnel, as he writes about it, he has the candle in his mouth, keeping it above the water that is giving him barely enough room to breathe. Well, he makes his way all the way through this shaft and comes out into this open area, and he finds this shaft that goes up, and he managed to scale up it and ends up coming out in the house of an Arab family after busting through the wall in what is now the city of David. That shaft is called Warren's Shaft. The tunnel he found is what we know today as Hezekiah's Tunnel that Hezekiah dug to move the water source within the walls of the city when the Assyrians were looking to invade. Now, people just think, well, that must have been the way David and his men came in. They came in through the water tunnels, the water channel, and up into the city. And so they translate Zinor, water shaft. But we really have no idea what the word means. It's just a guess. So, with that as background, we're going to look at the big but. And what I'm going to share with you is coming from an article by Dr. Linda Belleville, who is a professor of New Testament at Cornerstone University, which is formerly Grand Rapids Theological Seminary in Michigan. This is not a liberal institution. This is a conservative, evangelical institution. And her article has a really fancy name, Lexical Fallacies in Rendering Authentane in 1 Timothy 2:12, BDAG in Light of Greek Literary and Non-Literary Usage.
What's BDAG mean?
BDAG is the abbreviation for the Definitive Dictionary of New Testament Words. It stands for Brown, Driver, and I can't remember who G is. It's the initials of the author. It's commonly known as BDAG. That's how we refer to it. I've got a copy. I should have brought it, but it's about this thick and about that big. Anyway, I forgot to bring it. But a lot of what I'm talking about came from Dr. Belleville's research because I think it's very compelling. So here's the passage. We're looking at verses 8 through 15. Paul writes to Timothy, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Also, that the women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing, not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, but reverence for God. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. The plain reading of the text.
It's
Question?
about a sentence.
Oh, I did? Sorry.
Or expensive clothes, but with good works,
Uh-huh.
as is proper for women who
Oh,
profess
thank
reverence
you.
for God.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Sorry to not be silent.
Thank you. I shall learn in submission.
How your home is.
So, let's start with the men. What does Paul say to the men? What does he want them to do?
Pray, lift up holy hands.
Pray, lifting up holy hands.
Without anger or argument.
Okay, without anger or argument. I didn't peek during prayers this morning, but how many men were lifting holy hands while we were praying? Okay. Interesting data point. So what does he say about the women?
A lot more.
A lot more. Okay. All right. Two words jump out at me in there. They should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing. So my question is, what is modesty?
Cultural.
Okay, how so?
America and someplace in the Middle East.
Okay. On my trips to Israel, the women are required to have a modesty kit. And there are certain sites that we go to where the women have to put on their modesty kit. And that modesty kit is generally a long skirt, something that covers their shoulders, and in some sites a headscarf, head covering. A hat is not sufficient. It has to be a head covering. There was a big debate I've seen in the last year on social media about Lululemon yoga pants as being a violation of Paul's prescription for women to dress modestly. Is that what Paul's talking about? I think Paul describes modesty here. And he describes it this way: not with their hair braided or with gold, pearls, or expensive clothes. Modesty in the ancient world is not about how revealing or exposing your clothing is in terms of your sensuality or your sexuality. Modesty is about flaunting your wealth. And therefore, Paul says to them, don't braid your hair, don't put on your gold, don't put on your pearls, don't put on your expensive clothes. And I want you to think about this. If we're dealing with a mixed community, socialized mixed community of some wealthy people, some tradespeople, some slaves, some poor people, okay, if you're at the bottom rung, you probably only have one set of clothes, maybe two. And your clothes are probably related to your social position. So it's not like everybody's got to go pick from their closet and say, well, today I'm going to wear this or I'm going to wear that. At the very upper levels, that might be an option, but it's not for most other people. And so Paul's really writing, I think, to these upper level people to say, don't flaunt your wealth, because you're flaunting your wealth promotes the social levels that we're trying to break apart. Now, I want you to read a quote. It's not really a quote. It's something, and I wonder if you've ever heard this. We should wear our best to church because we are coming into the Lord's house. After all, if you were going to meet the queen, or now the king, of England, you would put on your finest clothes. Shouldn't you give God as much respect as you would give the queen or king of England? Anybody's parents ever use that when they were trying to get ready for church in the morning? Okay. How do you read that in the context of what Paul wrote in 1 Timothy? Is it right or wrong? I'm sorry, I'm hearing mumblings, but I'm not hearing any words.
I think we were brought up to believe that was a respectful thing.
Okay, we were brought up to believe it was the respectful thing to do.
To show reverence.
To show reverence. Okay?
Well, even today, if you attend a funeral, I dress up a little more than your standard would do.
Okay, yeah, if you attend a funeral, you might wear different clothes. If you attend a wedding, you might wear different clothes. There are places where we wear different clothes for different occurrences. Okay? And what sets those?
Expectations.
What kind of expectations? Cultural, social expectations of where we live. Okay? It's not a universal statement. Except, I think Paul's saying, for this context that he's dealing with, we've got a lot of social stratification here. And we're trying to diminish those because we are neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female. And therefore, Don't put things in place that put barriers between you and the other members of your community. And that means dress modestly. Don't put on your best stuff. Okay? Don't make the social distinction obvious.
Just go flaunt your stuff.
Don't flaunt it. Okay? And not flaunt it meaning sexually. Don't flaunt it meaning your wealth. Because they have a different view than we do. Okay? Now, there's something that's easily overlooked in this whole passage. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. What's the verb? Learn. Okay. And it's actually slightly more complicated than that. It's actually let learn. The verb is mantheneto, and it's an imperative, meaning it's a command. Okay? So we're doing grammar today. If you haven't figured that out yet. It's a command. They must learn. Okay? That's the command. Now, my question to you is, what's remarkable about this command? It's directed just at the women.
Because they're finally getting to learn.
Right.
Oh! Because they're finally getting to learn.
New command.
Education of women was not valued. In some circles, the religious education of women was unacceptable. Yes, sir.
I may be getting ahead, but can you distinguish between the language for wife and woman?
Excellent question. Hold that thought. Hold that thought. We're coming to that. Paul's command is that women learn is an expression of value. Okay? It is quite remarkable. And I'm going to refer you to two quotes we looked at last week. Okay? This is from John Chrysostom, major church theologian in Constantinople in the late 4th century and 5th century. The woman taught once and ruined all. On this account, therefore, he, Paul, says, let her not teach. But what is it to other women that she suffered this? It certainly concerns them, for the sex is weak and fickle. Okay, remember that from last week? Or this, which comes from a slightly earlier time, from Jewish teachings, from the Mishnah. Whoever teaches his daughter Torah teaches her obscenity. Now, this is a statement made by Jewish rabbis. What is Paul? Paul's a Jewish rabbi. And Paul is saying the women need to learn. They must learn. He's saying that's not right. Okay? So, now we get to the big but. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Well, what do we do with this? We're going to diagram this sentence out. Okay? And I'm sorry if I'm causing some of you to have PTSD from your high school English classes. But I'll try to make it simple. If there are any English teachers in the room, forgive me if I do it wrong. But I'm pretty sure I've got it mostly right. So in the Greek, there is an implied subject here. The implied subject is I. Okay? Greek verbs are such that the person is assumed in the verb. We don't do that really in English. In Greek, they do it. And if you put the pronoun I in there, it's always for emphasis. The verb is do not permit. The direct object is a woman. Now, there's also two subordinate clauses. One is to teach, and they are joined with it doesn't show up in our English translations, but it's there in Greek, nor to have authority. And the object of that is a man. Okay? That's how this sentence is structured. And so, the problem we have, there are two challenges that I want to talk about. The first is this word, to have authority. And the second is, what do we do about these two subordinate clauses? How do we translate them when they're in this structure? So we're going to take that one at a time. To have authority is the Greek verb authentane. Okay? That's an infinitive version of the verb authentane. And it is what we call in language studies a hapax legomenon. Does anyone know what that means? It's what we shorten it. We call it a hapax because that's what they call it. Hapax legomenon. It means it's a word that's only used one time in the entire Bible. So the question is, how do we translate it if this word only shows up one time in the entire Bible? What do we do? How do we know what it means? What are our options?
See where it's used elsewhere.
See where it's used elsewhere. Okay. So where might we go to see where it's used elsewhere?
Other Greek writings.
Other Greek writings. Okay. So let's do that. If we go to classic Greek literature, okay, sort of the classical Greek, we've got tons and tons and tons of examples of classical Greek writings, literature. And even within classical Greek writings, this word is very rare. It does not show up very often. And when it does show up in classical Greek literature, it means to murder. Okay? Feeling any better yet? Where else might we go besides classic Greek literature?
Koine Greek.
The Koine Greek, the common Greek. And so we can look at other sources of Greek, things like letters between people, or other sorts of writings that might be what we call epigraphic writings, which are normally like writings on walls or on stone, things like that. And it turns out there, in these common language sources, this word is also very rare. But when we find it, it seems to mean to domineer or to dominate, or it means to originate. Now, remember, the Bible, the New Testament, is written in Koine Greek. Okay? So, what Dr. Belleville argues is that because this classical Greek literature really doesn't fit, and the definition is sort of weird, looking at other common language sources is probably our best bet for figuring out what Paul means when he uses this word. Now, given the context of these meanings, which do you think fits best?
Dominate.
To dominate. Okay? I'd agree with that. Okay? So, if we go back to our sentence, then we would probably replace to have authority with to dominate. Now, we'll come back to how we make all this work after we look at these two subordinate clauses. What does it mean when we have two things in Greek that are joined with a verb and a subordinate clause that are joined by a neither nor? Okay? And what we find is that when you look at the New Testament, when you look at that Koine Greek, when you have a neither nor construction like we have here, where you have a verb and these two subordinate clauses, that there are 6 different ways to translate it. Okay? And how they relate to one another. So let's look. Option 1 is that the two terms are synonyms. Okay? So in other words, here's an example from Galatians 4 where Paul says, You know that it was because of a physical infirmity that I announced the gospel to you. Though my condition put you to the test, you did not scorn or despise me. Okay? But welcome me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. So in this passage, scorn and despised are synonyms. Okay? It's Paul's way of emphasizing, look, when I came to you in the condition I was in, you didn't scorn or despise me. Okay? It's the same sort of neither nor construction. So my question is, does this match the usage we have in 1 Timothy 2:12? Are teach and dominate synonyms? No, I don't think they are. They are not synonyms. Option 2, closely related ideas. So for example, this is again Paul in 1 Thessalonians. But you, beloved, are not in darkness for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light and children of the day. We are not of the night or of darkness. Okay? So do you see here, night and darkness are not the same thing. They're not synonyms, but they are closely related ideas. Okay? So does this match what we see in 1 Timothy 2? I don't think it does either. I don't think that to teach and to dominate are closely related ideas. Let's look at number 3, opposites. This is the famous passage in Galatians 3. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave nor free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Jew or Greek are opposites. Slave and free are opposites. Okay? Now, it's very important to recognize here, he doesn't use the same construction for male or female. They are not opposites. It's male and female. Okay? Paul switches his language there intentionally. Okay? So, does this match to 1 Timothy 2:12? Are to teach and to dominate opposites? No. Okay. Option 4, what's called the general to particular. This is in 1 Corinthians 2, we see an example of this. Yet among the mature, we do speak wisdom, though it is not a wisdom of this age, or of the rulers of this age, who are doomed to perish. So you have the wisdom of the age, which is the general, and then you have the rulers of this age. The wisdom of the rulers of this age is a more particular, more specific example. Okay? So, does this match 1 Timothy 2:12?
No.
I don't think so. To teach is not a general, and to dominate is not the particular. And if he was saying to dominate than to teach, you'd have to reverse the word order. If dominate was this general and teaching was the specific, the word order would have to be reversed. Option 5. You hanging with me on this? I know it's a lot of grammar. A natural progression of closely related ideas. So, for example, this is from John 1. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. So here we see sort of a natural progression. They were not born of blood. They were not born of the will of the flesh. They were not born of man. Okay? This sort of progression of the idea. Does this match what we see in 1 Timothy 2:12?
No.
I don't think it does either. They are not closely related ideas. Teaching and dominating are not closely necessarily related things. So what's our final option? Option 6. And it's what's called a related purpose or a goal. And here we see this in a teaching of Jesus in Matthew 6. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust consume and where thieves do not break in and steal. So why do thieves break in? To steal. For the purpose of stealing. Okay? So, does this match 1 Timothy 2:12?
It could.
It could. Okay. Of all the ones we've looked at so far, it can. Because we can see, this is the NRSV translation I used earlier. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. If we apply that sixth option, then a better way to translate this would be to say, I do not permit a woman to teach for the purpose of dominating a man. She is to keep silent. So what Paul is objecting to here is not women teaching per se. It is teaching with a purpose. And what is that purpose?
To dominate.
Domination. Domineering.
So why don't they translate it?
Hold on to that thought for just a moment. Okay. I think, though, and this is something that Dr. Belleville points out that I think even adds a little bit to it. This translation, then, this option 6 translation, even has an interesting way of tying in this other phrase about her keeping silent. Because there's another way to translate that. And that becomes, I do not permit a woman to teach a man in a domineering way, but to have a quiet demeanor.
In other words, she can't be as rude.
Okay. Now my question is, would this apply to a man also?
Yes. It should.
It should.
It should. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because if a lot of the stuff that you've talked about, not translations, the sayings that you've had, it's exactly what they're saying is men dominating women, that women are weaker, you know.
Yeah.
But why would he have to say that?
Why would he? Oh, that's a very good question.
Okay.
Why would he have to say that? And we're going to talk about that next week. So I've not given you any of the. So I've been very specifically. What have we really not talked much about when we've examined this passage?
What's happening now?
Say, I didn't.
What's happening at that time?
What's happening at that time? What's going on in this specific location? We've dealt with grammar. Okay? The specifics of the grammar. I believe there are some things going on at this location that are causing this. And the location seems to be Ephesus. Okay? And there's a really big temple in Ephesus. Does anyone know who it's to? Artemis. And we'll talk about Artemis next week, and we'll talk about what happens in the final part of this passage, which gets even weirder, about women being saved through childbearing and yeah. Forget about baptism, just have a baby, that'll save you, right? Is that what Paul's saying? I don't think so. So the question is, why don't the translations say this?
Because it's men that have the translation.
You are,
Is that Sally?
yeah, so the comment, in case it didn't get picked on the mic, because men do the translation. And you know what, you're probably right. And more often than not, it's white men doing the translation. I didn't bring it, my...
And you want to even go into the society of the white men, in England and all that have done where they were in society.
Yes. There's another thing that I have a professor at SMU that I really, really like a lot. He's an African American man, and he's actually on the translating committee for the NRSV updated edition that just came out last year. And I meant to bring it's kind of become my go-to now translation. But one of the things that when translators work is you have this balancing act of people have memorized verses and memorized things in certain ways, and sometimes it's better not to upset the apple cart. Okay, to play with words that people are used to. We had one this morning. It's not a wrong translation. It's just not what I think gives the right meaning. I'll give you an example. For John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The Greek word there for world is cosmos. Now, when you hear when God so loved the world, how do you define world?
Earth, mankind.
Texas.
People.
Yeah.
People. Texas. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anymore. Okay. Cosmos is much bigger than just people. It can mean, there are times when cosmos means people. I'm not going to say that's not it. But in the context of that passage and the context of the larger message, as Wade said this morning about the restoration of all things, okay, cosmos is bigger than people. God so loved the universe. God so loved the created order. God so loved this whole earth and everything in it that he gave his one and only Son. Now, nobody's going to mess with John 3:16. Okay? And quite frankly, this is one of those verses that people, you change this verse, and I guarantee you it's going to, does anyone know the story of the ESV version? English Standard Version? Okay. So, the New International Version was kind of the go-to Bible for evangelical Christians. Okay? It was easy to understand. And in 2011, the NIV committee decided that they had improperly translated a number of references that were generated as male, okay, that in Greek are better translated as inclusive of both genders. So for example, in Greek, when it says, brothers in a plural, in Greek that can mean a group of only men, or it can mean a group of mixed gender. And they decided that they were going to update the entire NIV version to properly include those gender-inclusive statements to make it more faithful to the Greek text. And what was the reaction? Evangelical Christians lost their minds and set up a separate committee to come up with a new Bible that put it back. Okay, and that version is the ESV. The ESV is a translation with an agenda. And that agenda is, if the text says brothers, we're going to say brothers, because that's the plain reading. Forget what the Greek says or what the Greek means. Okay, we're going to put brothers back in. ESV is the only translation I won't use out of solidarity with not agreeing with the agenda that went behind the translation. So, there's another passage where I think this sort of shows up. And this is in Revelation 2, verse 20. But I have this against you. You tolerate that woman, Jezebel, this is the church at Thyatira, who calls herself a prophet and is teaching and beguiling my servants to practice fornication and to eat food sacrificed to idols. Now, this has that same sort of construction, but instead of being neither nor, it's both and. Okay? But it's really interesting that it's the same teaching and beguiling. Okay? She's teaching for the purpose of beguiling my servants. And what is she teaching them to do? Practice fornication, to eat food sacrificed to idols. Okay? And yet in this case, we translate it according to how the rule ought to work. But we don't in 1 Timothy 2:12. We're just about out of time. There's one other issue, and that is a man and a woman. Greek has one word for husband and man. It's called aner. It also has one word for woman or wife, gune. How do you know which word to use in English? How do you know? Context. There's also another rule that some people apply that generally works but not always, and that is if they appear in the same sentence, it's normally talking about a husband and a wife. Normally. At least that's probably ought to be your first go-to. But it doesn't always hold. So, it's equally possible to put in a wife and a husband into this passage. So where does that leave us? One option could be, I do not permit a woman to teach a man in a domineering way, but to have a quiet demeanor. Or, I do not permit a wife to teach a husband in a domineering way, but to have a quiet demeanor. So my question then, is this a universal prohibition against women teaching men? It's really hard to make that case. We have hung a whole theological foundation, a whole set of baggage around the role of women on a word used once in the entire New Testament and rarely used outside the New Testament in the Greek of its day. And taken it as if it's God's solid, clear, plain truth that cannot be read any other way. And yet when you look carefully at how the Greek grammar works, if you look carefully at how the sentence is structured, and you look at how the word is used in other places, you come to a reasonable, different conclusion that is much easier to support than the way we currently have it situated. Questions?
Why can't I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Why can't option 3 be, I do not permit people, I do not permit spouses to teach their spouse in a domineering way, but to have a quiet demeanor, because that is the example of Christ.
That would be wonderful if Paul decided to say that, but he didn't. I wish he did, but he didn't.
So, I guess you're going to address the next paragraph next week. Is that?
Yes.
Because that seems like an argument.
Okay.
You know, that
Yep,
you go
yep.
back and that kind of follows. But then I have one quick question.
Yes.
If we go back to the whole modesty thing,
Yes.
so the men don't have to comply with, I mean, I know they probably don't braid their hair so much, but they do have nicer clothes if they're in the upper echelon.
Yeah,
So
that's a
why-
really interesting question.
Why isn't it addressed?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Nobody ought to do that.
That's a very good question. Yeah, I'm not, again, if you recall back to last week and the week before, the Bible is a patriarchal text. Okay? There's no doubt about that. But what I find really interesting are the places where it breaks from the patriarchy that you would expect. And where do we see Paul breaking from that patriarchy here?
But I also remember Esther, and the king likes to show off his money by dressing up his wife.
Ah,
So
okay.
that's really what I thought of.
Okay,
Not
that's an
women.
interesting...
Women didn't have the money back then. So the men had all the money, honey, you go by and dress up because it makes me look even better than you.
Okay, possibly. That's an interesting interpretation. I'd not thought of that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just a thought, if you go with option 2, where it's speaking to a husband and wife, and you go back through and read the entire passage, not just the singular verse,
Yeah.
where the instruction is to a husband about his praying and not to be, arguing and angry. In that whole context, could it be, I mean, we take it as meaning in the worship setting, in the
Yes,
body.
yes.
But could it have been instruction for happy homes?
That's another possibility. Another possibility. We'll look more at the cultural stuff next week. I do want to show you one other example to think about. And this is in Acts 18. Now there came to Ephesus, Ephesus again, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. He was an eloquent man, well versed in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. And when he wished to cross over to Achaia, the believers encouraged him and wrote the disciples to welcome him. On his arrival, he greatly helped those who, through the grace, had become believers, for he powerfully refuted Jews in public, showing with the scriptures that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, what is Priscilla's role in Apollos' instruction?
Like it was equal, based on what it says.
And even more major, she's first mentioned.
We'll talk about this in coming weeks. It's not a critical one, so we're going to cover some other stuff first. But if you want to do something fun, go look in your Bible and look at the references to Priscilla and Aquila. The first time they're mentioned, he's named first. And then it flips. And then she's always mentioned first. And it's very important that this verb is, they took him aside. Not Apollos, not he, they. So she's clearly involved in his teaching. Okay? In Ephesus, where 1 Timothy is written. Okay? Another one you can look at is Saul and Barnabas, or Paul and Barnabas. Follow the wording of their names, the order of their names. It flips. It flips. Because word order has to do with who's the more important. I'm going to argue Priscilla is taking a lead role. Now, you don't have to agree with me on that. That's fine. But the point you can't have to accept is they both were involved in his teaching. Now, how do you reconcile that with 1 Timothy 2 if you keep the original definition like we see in most translations? It's much easier to do it with the way we have adjusted it based on the grammar. Quick question before we finish up.
I guess honestly, I was raised a little different. Anyway, I have always kind of taken to teach the woman want to teach the man in that society because women had not been taught already. Most of the time, they were not going to have the knowledge of Christ as the Messiah, the Torah, and all the learning that the man had.
Yeah.
So he's saying in Ephesus, with new Christians, that the woman wasn't to teach because she didn't have the background knowledge to be able to do it yet.
Yeah, that's the cultural argument that gets made. The argument I want to, and I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I think there's some validity to that argument. The argument I wanted to make today is not to base it purely on the culture, but to say grammatically, the way the Greek works, the definition or the way we translate it in our Bibles, in most English versions, is very difficult to support based upon how that grammar works in other places. Okay? And that I think that translation, for the purpose of dominating or domineering, she should have a quiet demeanor, is a much more defendable position. If you would like the article, it's a little technical, but it's not terrible. I'm happy to email you a copy. Just email me and I'll be happy to send it to you, or tell me and I'll be happy to email it to you. So, in quick summary, Paul commands women to learn. Let's remember that. Contrary to practices of the day, That verb authentein, to have authority, is a very rare word. The best option seems to be to dominate. The neither nor subordinate clauses are best translated as a for-purpose clause that reflects motive. Okay? And Paul's statement does not seem to be a universal prohibition of women teaching. It is a prohibition against teaching with the wrong motives. So next week, we're going to look at the last half of this passage and try to figure out what Paul's doing here. What is his argument and how does it fit? And how are women saved through childbirth? What's going on here? And we're going to have to dive into the culture of Ephesus to try to figure this out. Okay? Thank you all very, very much. I appreciate your questions, your participation, and look forward to seeing you all next week.
Good.